Good evening. I'm Dan Sheely, and I am the director of the Collegium Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture, as well as the executive director of the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society. And on behalf of both organizations, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Spring 2021 Forum of the Philosophy of Finance Project, which is entitled The Moral Responsibility of Business. As we all may be aware, that issue is becoming both increasingly pressing and complicated today. But my own role tonight is simple: to introduce this evening's moderator. Dr. Mike Kane is the director of the Philosophy of Finance Project, as well as a lecturer in the Penn Department of Economics. Dr. Kane completed his MA and PhD in philosophy at Boston College, where he taught in the humanities sequence for years, before founding Kestrel Investments, a single-family investment office here in the Philadelphia area. Through his professional experience, scholarship, and teaching, I would say that he himself embodies the aim of the Philosophy of Finance Project to bring together students, scholars, and practitioners to address the fundamental questions raised by the practice of finance. And that project flows from the core Catholic mission, or lowercase c Catholic mission, of the Collegium Institute to promote interdisciplinary reflection on the universal questions that animate human life. So, to moderate tonight's event, then, I'm most pleased to welcome Dr. Mike Kane.
Thank you, Dr. Chile, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join for this online discussion on the moral responsibility of business. I am encouraged to see a large turnout where about 2/3 of the attendees are students and faculty from universities around the country and even some internationally. And about 1/3 of our attendees tonight are coming from the practice of business and finance. So welcome to you all, and thank you for your participation. I'd like to welcome also acknowledge our sponsors who have been so gracious in promoting this event. The co-sponsors for tonight include the Penn Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, the Sioka Center for Business Ethics and Society at the College of the Holy Cross, the Wharton School's Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department, the program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics here at Penn, the Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, and the IESE Business School. So thank you very much to our sponsors. I think this is a very timely topic, and it's interesting to see the level of turnout and engagement as this has been put together as a program for discussion tonight. I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We have the great benefit of really two of the top leading scholars in the field are joining us tonight. First, we have Dr. Kendi Hess, who is the Brake Smith Associate Professor of Social Philosophy and Ethics at the College of the Holy Cross. She has served as the director of the Sioka Center for Business Ethics and Society, one of our co-sponsors tonight, and has authored numerous articles on business ethics, corporate agency, and collective responsibility. She is the co-editor of two books, one on ontology, ethics, and social justice, and another on nonviolence. So welcome, Dr. Hess. Also joining tonight will be Dr. Eric Orts, who is the Guardsmark Professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and teaches in the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department here at Penn. He has been the faculty director of the Initiative for Global Environmental Leadership and has served on the editorial board for Business Ethics Quarterly. His numerous scholarly publications include topics on corporate governance, environmental law and policy, and professional ethics. Dr. Orts is the author of two books, especially relevant to tonight's topic. The first is called Business Persons, a Legal Theory of the Firm. And the second is the edited volume, The Moral Responsibility of Firms. To frame the discussion, I want to refer to two very small but highly influential statements that have come out over the past 50 years. So just north of 50 years ago, Milton Friedman published a very famous article in the New York Times Magazine, where the thesis that he embraced was also the title of the article, and that was the social responsibility of business is to maximize its profits. And that gives rise to what's known as the shareholder primacy argument, that businesses are really accountable to their shareholders in a primary sense. The second is the piece that the Business Roundtable published in August of 2019, reversing what was effectively decades of advocacy for shareholder primacy. And so when the Business Roundtable published that in 2019, it was their first statement embracing what's called stakeholder theory. And so I think those two polls that frame the dialogue, that a business is responsible only to its shareholders, or there's an argument that there's this broader constituency widely drawn to be called stakeholders. So with that as the background, I'd like to start with Candy, because I think that Friedman's article is often interpreted to say that the only responsibility a business has is to maximize profits. And Friedman's a little bit more nuanced than I think he's commonly given credit for. And Friedman distinguishes between the moral responsibility of a business, which is actually something he acknowledges in absolute terms. I mean, to obey the law and to follow social norms and customs. And the social responsibility, where Friedman thinks that business is intruding into the role of government. So could you maybe unpack the two different kinds of responsibility that you think are in Friedman, and then how you think he negotiates those two?
I would love to. Thank you, Mike. I'm going to share some screen here. I've got a couple of PowerPoints, and I will walk you guys through this. I'm going to be moving really quickly through a lot of territory, so I'm going to skim kind of lightly over the top. More than happy to go back and answer questions about any of this in more detail if anybody wants to really dig in. But there we go. So I'd like to talk about the moral responsibility of firms, and I'm going to make the shocking claim that Friedman was right. 3 question marks. I love using that in a title because it always gets people pissed off. Okay, so what we're talking about here tonight is the question of what I'm calling the question of firm responsibility. And so one way to cash that out is to ask, what do firms owe to those around them in terms of consideration, restraint, and support? So that's one way to get at what we're really asking when we're asking about firm responsibility. Now, when you look at that, that's pretty obviously a moral question. It's using moral terms, and it's the kind of question where if it was anything other than a firm, we would immediately turn to traditional questions of morality. We would turn to the traditional moral or ethical theories to answer it. And so if we did that, what we would be doing is treating firms as what we call moral agents, and then we just apply traditional moral theory to that. So that's what corporate moral responsibility would be. It would be using those traditional theories. But that's not how we went after it in this actually existing world. Instead, we tried to answer that question in terms of what we called social responsibility. Okay, so moral responsibility is all the stuff you ever thought about morality. But we tried to answer that in terms of social responsibility. What is that, right? I tried to write a paper, I don't know, God, maybe 10 years ago about moral responsibility. And I wanted to just throw in a quick footnote about, how this is different than social responsibility. So I just wanted a quick statement from somebody about exactly what corporate social responsibility is. 10 years later, I still have no idea. And it turns out, Nobody knows. Nobody really knows what corporate social responsibility is. It's a highly contested term. Now, in practice, if you ask people to actually cash it out, like what do firms do when they are practicing social responsibility, it turns out it's mostly moral responsibility. It's things that are recognizably required by traditional moral theories. But there's some disturbing extras hidden beneath the confusion that I'd like to draw your attention to tonight. So what I'm going to suggest is that CSR permits or even demands that firms move beyond private moral practice and actually govern. And I think that's a problem. Me and Milt. Okay, so corporate moral responsibility. So again, the question of firm responsibility, what do firms owe to those around them? Now, corporate moral responsibility would just say we take traditional moral responsibility and apply it to firms, to corporate agents. So that's so obvious that it's worth questioning why we wouldn't take that approach, because we didn't. So would there be a reason to not take this obvious path? And there's two, actually. One concern would be that these traditional moral obligations just aren't demanding enough, that firms are so big and so powerful and they should be doing so much, and traditional moral theories just aren't really going to capture that. So that was one concern. And another one is that traditional moral obligations theories just don't apply to firms. So I want to take each of those very quickly in turn. So the first concern is that basic moral obligation just isn't demanding enough. And there's some support for this interpretation, because within the CSR literature, which is talking about social responsibility, every now and then, if somebody actually mentions moral responsibility as a different thing or as a contrast, it's really limited and it's weak. It's things like, don't lie, cheat, or steal, maybe make a couple charitable donations every now and then. And that seems to be the extent of morality, at least as it's recognized within this literature. Now, speaking as an ethicist, traditional morality is incredibly demanding, both for human agents and by extension for corporate agents. And so without going into any detail, utilitarianism, says that each moral agent has to maximize pleasure and minimize pain in all of sentient creation, right? So there's the goal there. For Kant, you have to identify every single rational agent that you're engaging with and make sure you're treating each one as an end and actively supporting their ability to exercise their autonomy. For Aquinas, you have to move yourself and the entire piece of creation around you toward perfection. Aristotle, you have to perfect yourself in a way that enables the perfection of the people around you. So all of these are incredibly demanding, even in their original old dead guy forms. And then now we have all of that happening within an entirely interwoven global context where we're constantly affecting people and beings all over the world in the context of a rapidly deteriorating environment. So corporate moral responsibility would be plenty demanding. That's not a problem. The more likely concern is this idea that traditional moral obligations don't apply to firms, that traditional moral obligations were developed with an eye toward regular moral agents, real moral agents, people, and it just doesn't apply to firms. Now, that was a real concern back in the 1940s when these ideas of corporate social responsibility were first coming out. But the literature on collective and corporate responsibility has developed significantly since that time. So what I'm going to introduce tonight is my own account of corporate agents. There are others from List and Pettit, from French, but I'll just give you a quick skim on mine. So for mine, a corporate agent is a collective. It's a group of people unified by a structure, a network of social relationships that embodies an RPV, which sounds technical, but it's just a rational point of view. It's a set of beliefs and desires that guides action, commitments about fact and value. So to get a sense of what that is, so if you got a group of people, they've got all their own commitments, right? The commitments about how the world is and what matters in it. And because they have different commitments, when they move, they go all over the place. But you can organize them. You can organize them by any of a number of different means, possibly by a structure, by a set of social relationships that place constraints on their actions. And once you've organized them, they still have all their own commitments about fact and their own commitments about value. They have their own intentions about movement. They can be committed to not X, not Y, and Z. But the structure that organizes them can have its own commitments built into it. The structure can be premised on assumptions about how the world is and what matters in it. And because of the way those assumptions are built into the structure, built into the incentive system that guides the members who have joined the structure, when that collective moves, when those members act as members of the structure, the collective action that they take will express the commitments of the structure and not the commitments of the individual members. Now, I don't know if that sounds kind of spooky and weird or not, but it's completely familiar. All of us have had the experience of being a member of a group, or especially of an organization, and following policies that we didn't agree with or didn't even understand, but now you have to do it this way, so okay. And that's how we implement policies that express values we don't have without changing our own. So there's this divergence. So that's a group of people organized by a structure that embodies an RPV. And so when you have something like that, hopefully that sounds familiar, but it has some philosophical implications. When you've got that, you've got something that can generate its own unique intentional states, which are beliefs and desires. It can act on the basis of those beliefs and desires. Corporations do things. It can take morally relevant information into account when it does so. May not, but it can. And so when you have something like this, just about any firm of any size will qualify, as will governments, NGOs, colleges, etc. So when you have something like this, what you have is a corporate agent, which will be a material object. This isn't some spooky woo-woo thing. This is the Soylent Green moment. Corporations are made of people, right? People are material objects. Corporate agents are material objects. They're agents, able to act on their own beliefs and desires and intentions, and they're moral agents. So with that, all on the basis of traditional philosophical moral accounts, they are bound by traditional moral obligations. That's how that goes. And that does allow for potential deviations. This doesn't commit you to any particular moral theory. So with all that, that gets us corporate moral responsibility. And that makes it, I think, a pretty attractive option in terms of how we answer that question about firm responsibility. CMR is relevant, it's applicable, it's demanding. It provides a highly articulated, richly developed theoretical framework, frameworks that we have been working on for millennia, thousands of years worth of theorizing that have helped us figure out the basic obligations that adhere to moral agents, the exceptions to those obligations, the exemptions from those obligations, the role-specific nuances, priority and conflict among those. We've got millennia of theorizing about this stuff, and we're not using it. And we should be. We could have, but we didn't. Corporate social responsibility is what we did instead. So for corporate social responsibility, again, we've got this question we want to answer, and we say, what would social responsibility tell me about this? Well, it isn't an established term like moral responsibility is. So there isn't a big, long history that we can draw on to interpret it. We can't interpret the traditional accounts because there aren't any. We can't look to applications in other contexts because there aren't any other contexts for social responsibility. So what is it? Well, it turns out that over the time that we've been talking about CSR, which again starts from the 1940s, there have been 4 different generations. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, but basically the first one is this broad powers and concerns, 50s into the 60s, that wants corporations to be overseeing the entire economic system for the benefit of society. So that's sort of the phrase for that one. That switched into enlightened self-interest, which had them doing pretty much the same thing, but mostly as a recognition of sort of maintaining your own environment, kind of a move to it. But again, still very broad with general responsibility for social function. By the 80s and 90s, we had this massive expansion of an understanding of what was included in CSR. And that came from 2 sources. One was a set of articles from Archie Carroll, where he just changed the meaning of the term. It used to mean taking care of society, and he just changed it so that it included all of the responsibilities of a firm. So for this time, corporate social responsibility included economic, legal, ethical, and philanthropic. That's what social responsibility meant. And the other thing that happened in here is Ed Freeman came along and gave a stakeholder theory, which exploded it again. And then that morphed into the strategic CSR of the 2000s, where it's really just another strategy for business practice. So all of these are still present in the conversation. So when people are talking about CSR or arguing about it, all of these very different conflicting conceptions are sort of running around in the discourse. And so with all of that, I would say CSR really isn't a very attractive paradigm. It's conceptually confused, it's under-theorized, at least compared to corporate moral responsibility. And it doesn't really get us anything, or not very much. most of the practice of CSR, as I've already said, is really just moral responsibility. So we can shift to moral responsibility without using most of the practices that we want, but not everything. Some of the things that CSR includes is the obligation to oversee the operation of an economic system that fulfills the expectations of the public. They're supposed to take an active role in the solution of broad social problems. They're supposed to concern themselves with the needs and goals of society, which they're apparently competent to identify or legislate. And they should work to support and improve that social order. And so I've interpreted this to say that under the cover of CSR, firms are moving beyond private action and directly into the political arena. And I worked this out before everything that started happening in Georgia. And that brings us to corporate political responsibility, which we're not going to talk about today. And that gets us back to Friedman, right? So Friedman had this article back in the 70s. It's not even a full page, but everybody's read it, and it feels like nobody's really paid attention to it. As Mike had said at the beginning, it constantly gets interpreted as saying corporations should just be making money for their shareholders because that's what corporations do. And it's actually a much more sophisticated and interesting analysis. And I'm going to argue that the whole thing that I just gave you is actually what Friedman is stuck with, whether he wanted it or not. So again, in his Times piece, he says that businessmen, I'm sure there weren't any women in the world, businessmen are bound by traditional moral obligations. So just the individual people are bound by traditional moral obligations. Given the recent developments around corporate moral agency that I kind of sketched, that means he effectively acknowledges corporate moral responsibility. He is rolling over in his grave. I'm not saying he's happy about it, I'm just saying he's stuck with it. Okay, so there's that one. He's also adamant that businessmen are not bound by social responsibilities as opposed to these moral responsibilities that he recognizes. So he thinks CSR is problematic both because it cuts into profits and because it violates fiduciary duties, right? He does talk about those two things. But even when it does neither, it's still wrong. So even where CSR, like strategic CSR says, is profitable, and even where it's consented to by all of the relevant shareholders, it's still inappropriate. It's inappropriate because it makes businessmen into self-selected legislators, executives, and jurists. It bypasses the elaborate constitutional, parliamentary, and judicial provisions established to ensure government action matches the will of the people, and it usurps governmental prerogatives. So we're all familiar with that idea that with great power comes great responsibility. And by the way, the actual source for that is in fact Spider-Man. I chastised my students for years, and I finally went out to look for it myself. I said, Spider-Man is not the source of this quote, and it is. It is Spider-Man 17, if you need to cite it anywhere. But we're all familiar with it, thanks to Peter Parker. But what we don't usually pay attention to is the corollary, that with great responsibility comes great power. CMR leaves firms in their traditional role as providers of goods and services, subject to familiar moral obligations, which are powerful and constraining and require a lot of positive action. CSR invites firms to step outside of their traditional role, to work on the improvement of the social order, and to start setting and redefining legal and moral standards in a global world. And the more responsibility firms take for society, the more power they have over it. Now, we can address this by making these governing firms more accountable, like government would be, but then what have we gained? We've just made the governing firms into governments. And so again, I'm going to say Friedman was right, astonishingly enough. We should adopt CMR, abandon CSR as currently understood, and avoid corporate political responsibility like the plague that it probably is. Thank you.
Wow, great. Thank you, Kendi. That's fantastic. So before we turn to Eric, let me ask you a couple of questions on how you understand that argument relative to Friedman himself. So Friedman's critique of corporate social responsibility maps pretty well to the critique that you made. So it's poorly defined. There's a principal agency problem that you're basically using shareholder money to advance causes that shareholders have no say in. So that's the legislator, jurist, and all wrapped up into one. There's a knowledge problem that, if you're in a particular business in an industry, how are you competent thereby to address social things like racial equity or his example is inflation, if you remember what that used to look like.
Yeah.
So I think on the topic of the social responsibility, there's good alignment there, that it's not defined enough, and it has so many other philosophical problems that it's not really actionable for corporations. But Friedman also argues that a corporation is an artificial person, and only persons, natural persons, can have responsibilities in a moral sense. And this is where you depart from Friedman.
Yeah.
So I could play devil's advocate for Friedman, not to offend any Satanists here, but if I were to play devil's advocate for a second, Friedman would argue that there's nothing you're capturing under corporate moral responsibility that's not captured under the mere imperative to follow the law. Okay. So, what moral decisions are businesses making that are not already don't already have parameters set by existing law and regulation?
Oh, okay. That's not where I thought you were going. Yeah. Well, so in here, this is how I kind of got into this whole project in the first place. The relationship between the corporations or corporate agents. I'll move to the corporate agent. The relationship between the corporate agent and ethical demands and the law is really going to be pretty much the same as the relationship between any individual human person and ethics and the law. We're all constrained by all kinds of laws. I'm not allowed to run out and stab people. I'm not allowed to drive faster than whatever. Maybe I'm supposed to wear my mask. I'm not sure if that's a legal thing, right? Well, actually, that's a perfect example. Okay. Yeah. So there are legal constraints that are enforced by the state, but ethical theory is much more nuanced and much more detailed and much gentler and much more expansive than the requirements of law. There's a lot of stuff I ought to be doing that I'm not legally required to do. And I shouldn't be legally required to do. I should call my mom more often than I do. I should. Right? That's a moral obligation. I could cash it out under any theory you'd care to choose. But it would be wildly inappropriate for the state for us to bring the coercive power of the state to bear in order to police that or require it. And so just as there are things that I really ought to be doing, morally speaking, there are things that firms really ought to be doing, morally speaking, that would have to do with how they treat, and then pick your moral theory. It would have to do with how much pain and suffering they cause, with how much pain and suffering they could avoid but don't. Almost all of the environmental regulations are going to fall easily under utilitarian analysis, or even under a Kantian analysis. We have corporations that are treating their workers like machines. The constant, incessant division of labor until work is meaningless and unsatisfying isn't acceptable under a Kantian system. It's not illegal, but it isn't acceptable. And we can continue to work that kind of stuff out as we move through.
Okay, excellent. So Eric, one of the responses to Friedman has been the development of stakeholder theory. That can be construed in a narrow sense or in a broad sense. And you've been arguing in some of your published work that stakeholder theory is helpful in a narrow sense in limited applications to things like business theory or theory of the firm, but it's not robust enough to address the actual moral responsibilities businesses need to act under. So can you walk us through your sort of some background on stakeholder theory and then your particular take on it, please?
Yeah, sure. And so first of all, I just want to thank you, Mike, for the invitation. And it's really nice to see Kendi again. And we agree on a lot of things. And so I'd like to put first some perspective on how I agree with a lot of what Kendi said, and then I'm going to answer your question about stakeholder theory. I think one thing, especially for people who are in practical business situations, it's helpful to understand that the argument that you should care about ethics is not something to be afraid of. So once you get into it, there's a lot of talk about, and I teach this myself, I teach the difference between consequentialism and deontology. I usually abbreviate that as duty-based theories for students, MBA students and undergraduate students. But at the end of the day, one way I think about a business is it's about two things, and I think this is generally consistent with what Kendi's saying, and both fall under the rubric of business responsibility, which is the title of the course I teach MBAs in a core course at the Wharton School. One is profits. So that's the definition of a business. And so ever since Max Weber and the founding of the system that we have, a primary point of a business is profits. And if you don't consistently, or at least usually perform on that level, then you're not a business. You go bankrupt, you're out, and you're something else. And if you're getting contributions to keep going, then you're a nonprofit, right? So the first objective is making profits. And then I think one mistake that some business people make is that they fall into the modeling that some of my colleagues, and this goes back quite a ways in economics and finance, will say, well, it's about profits, and so that's the only objective. So let's maximize profits, and in particular, there are residual owners in a corporation. Let's maximize profits for the shareholders. That means value for the shareholders if you're a publicly held company. And then let's forget about the other part. And let's just say, if the law requires you to do something, okay. And maybe, okay, yeah, we're not going to commit crimes. We're not going to kill people on the way. But sometimes we'll even do a cost-benefit analysis to see what we can do. And so I think one comment that Kendi made, an observation that she made, we had, you mentioned the book, The Moral Responsibility of Firms, which Craig Smith and I edited, and we had a conference at INSEAD, and Kendi was there, and she has a very good chapter. And one of her observations in the chapter was there was a lot of debate about an issue about whether individuals are the ones who have moral responsibility, or can firms themselves as firms have moral responsibility. And in fact, that's a huge debate. But one of the observations Kendi made was everyone agrees who's looking at this issue that there's moral responsibility there. So that's kind of my main point, is that for those who are in practice, and I think most people in practice, if you ask them, CEOs, people will say, yeah, I'm making moral judgments all the time, as well as following the objective of trying to make money for the firm. And yeah, I want to make as much for the people who are involved here as possible, but there's also the purpose of the firm, and there's a constraint of moral responsibility, what Kendi's talking about, and then we can get into issues about what are those other moral constraints. And the law says the same thing. So if you look at I also teach this in my courses, the American Law Institute's Principles of Corporate Governance says clearly that the primary objective is corporate profits and shareholder gain, as Friedman says. But then, as also you can find in Friedman, that's conditioned on following the law, ethical custom, what Friedman calls ethical custom, but what the principles, what the ALI says calls ethical considerations, and that can be a big concept, and then also philanthropic and other social welfare objectives. So it's written in the law, it's understood in practice, and then I think the benefit of seminars like this is to really dig down and think about what does that really mean. And that gets us to stakeholder theory. So stakeholder theory has been advocated, and Kendi mentioned some of the main advocates. The most famous advocates are colleagues like Ed Freeman. He now has a podcast, by the way, which I was just on, so it's partly self-promoting. He has a podcast on stakeholder theory. I think his son encouraged him to run. I recommend that viewers go check it out. There's some, I'm on there and some other people he interviews. But the basic understanding of stakeholder theory, as I understand it, is that it grew up in opposition to this idea that only stockholder maximization, only maximizing value for stockholders mattered. Nothing else mattered. And we did get to that extreme. And you can, some of my colleagues in the Wharton School probably believe in this extreme, right? It's only stockholder maximization. If you do anything else, you're wasting your time or you're taking risks with the firm, et cetera. Don't worry about all this moral stuff or political debates in Georgia. Just maximize value. So there are a couple versions of stakeholder theory that respond to that. And one of my colleagues at the Wharton School, Thomas Donaldson, has very usefully, I think it might be the most cited article on stakeholder theory. And he basically divides the world into two versions. One version is called instrumental stakeholder theory. The other is normative stakeholder theory. Instrumental stakeholder theory basically takes the shareholder primacy objective as given. And then it says, in order to achieve this, you got to look at your stakeholders. How are you going to make a lot of money if you're running a complex firm for the shareholders, even if that's your only and main objective? If you're not taking care of your employees, if you're not watching out for different constraints, if you're not taking care of your customers, maybe more than just you can immediately make some money on them in 1 quarter or 2 quarters, right? So the instrumental view of stakeholder theory is consistent with a shareholder maximization or a shareholder primacy view. The second kind of stakeholder theory, though, is the normative model of stakeholder theory. And what that's saying is, wait a second, the firm is not just about the shareholders as the objective. So it actually does take Friedman on and say, Friedman's wrong. It's not just about shareholder profits. Because if you open up the firm, there's other interests going on. And there's nothing clearly that preferences that to give a preference to the shareholders when you also have a lot of other interests who are involved in the firm. So that is what is called a normative theory of stakeholder theory. And then under the normative kind of stakeholder theory, there are two other kinds. One kind is the broad theory, which I'm critical of in the work that you were indicating. And Friedman, I think, is one of those. And I won't go into the titles of one of my articles is Putting a Stake in Stakeholder Theory. And I'm afraid it sounded like I was comparing someone to a vampire. And I think we didn't mean to do that. I finally got out of that. I think it's agreed that I did not call anyone a vampire. But the idea there was twofold for putting a stake in stakeholder theory. First, my colleague, and this was written with my colleague at Wharton, Alan Strudler. First, was that the first idea was that the broad stakeholder theory model is just too broad to work. So a broad stakeholder theory, which many people will put in the natural environment, the government, customers, suppliers, your competitors even. And so if you're going to try to think about all those different groups, there's no objective that you get. And so a lot of people who are exposed to the broad stakeholder theory retreat and say, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to follow the one North Star of shareholder value. Let's get back to simplicity basics. So now what I argue for is a narrow version of stakeholder theory. And what that is, this is the stake. So we say put a stake back into the theory. It's not only about the shareholders, but it is, and we borrow this from Max Clarkson, who was a Canadian business ethicist. Anyone having an actual stake in the firm belongs in a stakeholder theory understanding of the firm. And so what we say, for example, is employees can be just as important as shareholders in running a firm. And a lot of managers, I think, will run firms that way. And a lot of people who are professionally engaged in re-engineering firms, and I hear this almost every time I teach my basic course to MBAs about the consulting industry, is that a big ethical question for consultants is when they're brought in and the objective is, let's maximize value for the people hiring me at the top, and let's fire some people because it'll increase our stakeholder, it'll increase our share price, and that's what we want. So I think that I'm in favor of bringing those direct interests back into the firm. And this includes managers, and this includes everyone who actually has a stake in the firm. But in some ways, state employees are just as vulnerable as some of the investors. And to some extent, I think creditors then belong in the firm as well. And that's a more narrow version of stakeholder theory. So that's a general overview. And let me just finish and come back to questions. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions also, Mike. Let's come back to the Business Roundtable statement, because there's a lot of different interpretations about that. So the Business Roundtable says that they are for stakeholders, and it was in front pages of the business press, et cetera, when they made this statement. And then there were a couple different reactions. One reaction was, this is just greenwashing or some kind of, or whatever kind of washing. It's actually not true. It's public relations. And these are a bunch of CEOs who are making public relations, and they want to stave off regulation, or they have some other agenda. In other words, it's not really true. Or it's an instrumental theory, right? That this is justifiable to the shareholders because, of course, stakeholders are important, but that's kind of an old theory. You don't really need to make a new statement about it. So, but maybe they were arguing we need to reassert that. Maybe they were pushing back against a shareholder primacy extremism, right? Some kind of view that only shareholders matter, and they're saying, wait a second, we really need to pull back from this precipice because there's lots of problems with that kind of analysis. And then some research has thrown into some question how genuine they were. So if you just take employees, for example. Some people went out and said, well, let's see what the Business Roundtable companies did when COVID-19 hit. Because if you really care about, if you really think employees are part of the firm who deserve to be part of the stakeholders, which I argue, I think employees are part of the firm, and you really should have moral considerations for them and not just treat them as cogs in a wheel, in a purely instrumental way. But it turns out, and I don't know if this has been replicated yet, at least one study has found that those firms who said they were stakeholder firms fired more of their employees off during COVID-19, and some firms that didn't take part were more ethical, we might say, with respect to their employees, and they didn't fire them. And I actually, can't talk about, but there was a good case that I just recently had in an MBA class where it was a very large Fortune 500 company. They're involved in a deal, COVID hit, and they had every reason to fire the employees. They could have said, COVID-19, sorry, our deal's off. But instead, the managers looked at it and said, we're not going to do that. We made this promise, we made this commitment to our employees. We're not going to do that. We're not that kind of company, and we're not that kind of people. And so I think that's an example that I think drives home the importance both of the statement that you started out with, the business responsibility statement, and then how you think about your moral responsibilities. And I'd also like to, I think on business, I use the term business responsibility because I agree with Kendi that there's lots in there. It's not just moral responsibility. I think we do have to care about the climate, for example. I have a new paper coming out. Well, it's not quite landed. I think I know where it's coming out with a colleague. It's called The Climate Imperative for Business. I think in the current circumstance, business must ethically take the climate seriously. Some businesses more than others. If you're a wind company, if you're doing wind power, you can maximize profits and probably be also on the right path. But if you're a giant oil company, you've got to really think seriously about your ethical obligations because you are causing a very serious problem. So I'm in favor of this expansive view of business responsibility. And yeah, it's going to be complicated. It's more complicated than just saying we don't care. Let's maximize value. Let's maximize profits, and we don't care what else. But that only gives you a little bit. That's not really human. To go back to Dan's introduction about what this kind of Catholic with a small c, a universal sense of what it is to do business. It is vicious just to do that. Just vicious just to care about profits, and most people don't. So then it makes sense for us to talk, as we're talking here, about what are the moral responsibilities. Are there political responsibilities? I think there are. Coca-Cola thinks there are. And we need to embrace, we need to look at racial problems in our society. Does a company have to do it? Yeah, it's part of the society. It's obviously part of an issue that we need to address, and business is part of a society. So it makes it complicated. Obviously, you can't change a business into a nonprofit organization or philanthropy. It has to focus on the basic mission of making money. But businesses also have to care about values, politics, morals, when it makes sense to do so. So thanks a lot for inviting me, and I hope we have a lot of time for questions left over.
Yes, we will. So let me start with one question for you, Eric, and thank you for those remarks. Another response to the Business Roundtable statement back in 2019 was that it's really a PR campaign, but businesses in the United States, which are organized under Delaware law, and I should mention both of our speakers have practiced corporate law, so we bring some real world perspective there. But under Delaware law, you're as the board of a company, you don't actually have the latitude to have this expansive group of stakeholders in sort of Ed Freeman's view of anyone affected by the company. You have a duty of loyalty, and you have a duty of care, and then you have wide discretion under the business judgment rule. So for Kendi and Eric, do you think that the legal framework is lagging sort of the social necessity? Is the legal framework sort of out of sync with what corporations really need to do? Or is it simply wrong to say, as Lynn Stout used to argue, that businesses are owned by their shareholders? That's not even a factual statement. And that's not how the law treats it. How would you weigh in on how the law treats stakeholder theory?
Can I take that one first, Kendi, or do you want to go?
You go.
Yeah, so many years ago, I practiced at Paul Weiss as a litigator, and we had 2 anti-takeover cases and that we represented. And so I think I have some sense, and I've written a lot in the corporate law area. And I think in general, the Delaware law of fiduciary duty rules are sometimes misstated to say that there is a duty to maximize return for shareholders. The more correct analysis of the more correct statement is that in certain situations that a company can either put itself into or gets put into, that you have to maximize the value for shareholders. And those particular situations are if the company puts itself up for sale and it's trying to sell itself off, the managers can't just do some sort of a private equity deal and not care what the shareholders are getting in the deal, right? Or so you have to, in that sense, you're in what's called Revlon land. It refers to a case that was famous in Delaware, where when you are changing the underlying structure of the company, then you have to do that. And in certain cases, an activist hedge fund or someone else can come into the company and say, you know what, I'm going to the shareholders, because at the end of the day, you have a proxy, the shareholders get to vote who's in control. So if you have a company, I've been involved in a few of those cases, if you have a company and they're ready, well, I don't care, like I'm paying 20% more per share than you are, then you take that to the shareholder vote, and there's a funny way of shareholders taking the 20% on that money. Now, you also mentioned, though, the business judgment rule, and you're right to say that's incredibly expansive. Unless you're in some of those extreme cases, now that means you really should, and for the most part, U.S. companies are probably empirically more shareholder value oriented, because you don't want to be targeted by an activist shareholder, et cetera. But in the absence of those exceptional situations, the business judgment rule is very broad. And that's why there's no chance, for example, that the shareholders are going to sue Coca-Cola or Delta and say, what in the hell are you doing down there taking a political position? It's hurting our shareholder value. That is within a business judgment kind of situation that CEOs have to take positions on all the time. And for example, I mentioned the climate imperative. If a company says, you know, we really have to, all the shareholders sent us this proposal, and 30% of them said we have to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. You know, what do you know? If they then say, well, let's start doing that. Let's start reporting our greenhouse gas emissions and let's line up with the Paris Agreement. We really have to start taking this down and measuring that. No shareholder is going to come in and sue you, right? You have business judgment rule protection for that kind of a moral and political judgment about what will be in the best interest of the corporation and its shareholders. So that's at least my understanding. One other development that's interesting here is the benefit corporation. So there are new kinds of benefit corporations that have cropped up that want to make exactly the problem you raise, which is like, well, what is it? Like maximize shareholder value like Revlon, or is it something else? And the benefit corporations are a movement where I think it's now 33, something like that states, including Delaware, have one. And you can reincorporate as a benefit corporation, which explicitly says that you don't have a fiduciary duty only to the shareholders, and you can't be taking it makes it more difficult to take over the company on that basis too. So that's an interesting development that we see in the law right now.
Yeah, not much to add to that. Mostly the breadth of the business judgment rule really provides an enormous amount of cover. And along with, I had mentioned 4 generations of CSR, and both the second and the fourth are focused on what Eric and of course Tom Donaldson had described as sort of an instrumental stakeholder kind of approach about the very real benefits to a business, at least potentially, of being seen to act morally. Generally speaking, it can pay well to treat your employees well, to take into account your impact on your local community and all of that. And there's a lot of research that was generated in connection with those 2 generations of CSR that can support that kind of movement if a board does feel defensive about doing that kind of stuff, even with the business judgment rule.
Okay, great. We actually have a question from Tom Donaldson for Kendi.
Oh God.
And it says, you exclude political responsibility from the corporate list of moral responsibilities. But what about imperfect duties? Under many circumstances, individual people and governments must clothe the naked and feed the hungry. Many theorists exclude these duties for corporations. More generally, how do we know which moral responsibilities to exclude and which to include?
Okay, I've got a whole 45-minute talk on that, and I can send you the slide deck if you want it. It's called And There Be Dragons. I think it's actually a much more interesting line in the sand than I had thought when I first started getting into this. The division between what I'm describing as moral responsibilities and which I like, and the political responsibilities, which I really don't like. And in fact, once you get those designated, there's a really narrow sliver in the middle for what really are social responsibilities, although I can't call them that anymore because that term is ruined. So I'd call them communal or citizenship responsibilities. But what I'm trying to get at with the division between moral responsibility and political responsibility are the kinds of rights and authorities that are reserved to a properly constituted government. And so it has to do with the exercise of power and coercion and opportunity and answerability. So we often, where this comes up is where we have a failed state. And so there is no government, and some corporation some multinat has a presence in the area. And so they start in a lovely move, they expand their security operations to start providing some kind of police protection or something to the surrounding areas, or they open up their own private schooling and they start allowing, local people to make use of their schools. All of that is great, I think, up to a point. I think it works as a temporary solution, but as soon as the corporation kind of settles into that space and starts thinking about the curriculum that it's going to allow those people to pursue, at that point, it's starting to make decisions about governing rather than helping out in a crisis. And at that point, I think they start to need to either back off and establish a real government, or they need to make themselves accountable to their now citizens in a way they simply aren't through the market. And so the difference between what I'm calling moral responsibility and political responsibility isn't so much about the content of the action, but about the exclusive exercise of authority within a jurisdiction, I think would be my first cut at distinguishing those.
Well, now's my chance. Well, first of all, good to see you. Good to see you, Tom. I wouldn't have cited your work if I knew you were in the audience. But just kidding. But I think this opportunity, I think for me, I was agreeing with Kendi for the most part, but now I think I'm gonna disagree a little bit. So I agree with Tom. Makes a very good point that the imperfect duties are hard to see. So that's an element of this moral responsibility. Once you're recognizing that, there's terrible things happening everywhere. We have COVID-19 crisis. We have people starving to death. We have failed states everywhere. We have the threat of nuclear war. We have the Russians getting ready to attack Ukraine. We have police difficulties and reform needed. So where does a company step in? And so I think that I haven't written on this myself, but I have a couple of thoughts. So one thought is the scale of the threat. And so that's why Brian Berkey and I don't know if Brian's on there too, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but is where we see climate is an existential threat to our entire civilization. Mm-hmm. If you spend any time looking at the science, and many people do, but some people are afraid to apparently, or they just don't want to listen to it, it is a disaster that's going to happen if we do not start doing things that are very serious very quickly within 10 to 12 years. And so Brian and I argue, given that predictable scale of the threat, that becomes one moral objective that jumps out, right? Because otherwise the whole civilization collapses.
Right.
It's not a joke, and people who don't want to look at it, that's fine, and everything will be fine for a little while, but we already see it happening, and just see what the California wildfires were, the storms, et cetera, and then multiply by 10, and then multiply by 100 and 1,000. So that's one thing. And then the other one, and this is where I will disagree with Kendi a bit, is on politics. So another person I should cite here is that Tom Lyon has and a number of other authors has an article on corporate political responsibility. And I should also disclose I'm going to do a book with Tom and another colleague, Bill Laufer, an edited book that's going to be called, I think, Corporate Political Responsibility. And I haven't written my chapter yet, so I don't really know what I think yet, but I do think that the issue of the democracy that we have is almost at the same level. Maybe is at the same level as climate, because if you lose your democracy, and this is the threat that I think Coca-Cola is facing. It's not just about racism, although I think also racism is up there, right? The whole history of our world is underpinned by this problem of racism. And you've seen companies all move that way after last summer. And I think that's what's so important with Coca-Cola, though, is that you have a threat to the democracy, where people are basically saying, we're not going to vote anymore, or this whole group of people is not going to vote in our state anymore. We're going back to Reconstruction and before Reconstruction. So I think in that case, you also have a situation which rises to the level where a company has to take a position, especially if you're Coca-Cola or Delta and you're right in the state, right? Your headquarters is in Atlanta. And for you to say, well, we don't see anything going on here, it's not credible. But I think your other points are good. Like, why not feed the hungry, everyone else? Those are just as terrible, aren't they? And there is a question of how do you judge among the evils of the world that, while at the same time you're making money and doing business, you also have responsibility to address.
Just to quickly follow up, I would agree with all of that. And the indirect duties are just moral duties, and we've got thousands of years. Well, if we start the indirect duties with Kant, we've got hundreds of years of talking about how to weigh the indirect duties and how to exercise wisdom to establish the extent of our indirect duties and the rest of that. Nothing about that is political, but But the increasing move to turn to corporations to solve political problems, that's one way of understanding the Me Too movement, is that the courts are too slow, and they're not acting, and the state isn't acting fast enough. And so we'll just bypass that, and we'll go to the employer and ask the employer to impose sanctions. And you see, part of what happens here is in almost each of these instances, they're mostly the corporations at the moment tend to align with my personal preferences about what they should be doing. So I feel a little guilty being critical about it, because I'm delighted about where they're coming down right now on all of these issues. But I keep having this echo in the back of my mind about, when they're not on my side. And I'm just concerned that we are going to regret authorizing their entry into this particular arena. I mean, they've always been involved in it. There's always been so much money. And there's always, I'm not saying that it was pure before, but the open, blatant assertion of corporate wealth and power on behalf of a political issue, I just have a bad feeling. My spider sense is tingling, and that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, and I think that that brings us back to Friedman, because I think if Friedman were here, well, he'd be 110 years old. If Friedman were here, he would say if government performed its basic duties around equality before the law, physical security in neighborhoods, feeding the hungry, and so forth, you wouldn't have conversations around social responsibility of business. And I think that there's, sort of a governance gap, that government isn't adept enough at responding, because it's working under a structure in which power is divided on purpose to make governing more cumbersome, under the American system anyway. And businesses can be much more responsive. So when you look at like FEMA's response to Katrina versus Walmart's response to Katrina, there's a way to govern by fiat almost in the private sector that government can't really do. But I think Friedman would say that, government rules by coercion, whereas market transactions are entirely voluntary, right? So if you don't like the direction Coca-Cola is going in, you can opt out of Coca-Cola products, or you can sell Coca-Cola shares. But when government says you have to do something, it's by coercion, and there may be an implied consent in a social contract, but there's not much more consent beyond that. So in Friedman's worldview, you want the role of government to be very limited and enumerated with its powers, and but giving government power to private corporations is problematic. And you're saying that, Kendi, but I think, Eric, I'm hearing that you think that businesses need to be much more involved in political issues. Let's take climate, for instance, right? So let's acknowledge there's a climate emergency, that the ability to address it through the democratic process of, signing the Paris Accord or whatever, is not urgent enough or robust enough. Should businesses just take on a responsibility to the environment as a moral absolute, independent of government guidance?
Yeah, so thanks for that question. So we just wrote an article saying yes. So yeah, we caught my colleague Brian and I. And so let me fill it out a little bit for you though, and connect it to Friedman. We don't cite Friedman in the piece, but the main argument is, as you stated, there's a climate emergency. All the scientists agree that it's there. The government's probably is not going to alone deal with it. The UN is pretty hopeless with respect to many regulatory problems in the world, and it's not likely to solve this one. So our argument is, yeah, it's all hands on deck. Everybody has to care about the climate problem. But let's connect it back to Friedman, because I've written about this before. I forget where, it's a chapter somewhere. But I have written on Friedman in an ideal world that Friedman sets up, there's sort of the businesses over here who are profit seeking, and then there's the government over here, and the government can be depended on to do the will of the people who are down here, who deal with the government, who elect the government over here, then they deal with the markets and the companies over here. And that there's a separation between the two. And Friedman says we can rely on the people here to keep the government here, and the government will do the best thing. The government will solve these problems. The government will deal with climate or other environmental problems. The government will regulate racial discrimination issues. The government will take care that voting rights are respected. The problem with Friedman is that he doesn't recognize that his profit motive over here can be taken by businesses, especially when they influence the political process. And my colleague Amy Sepinwall and I have written about this, where there's been more and more activity by companies, not on the issues we've been talking about, climate or Coca-Cola. It's actually, well, it's been on climate, but there's a book called The Merchants of Doubt that has pretty conclusively shown that the big oil companies and those who are involved in making money over here are not letting the political system go. In fact, they're trying to, and they're lobbying against having anything happen on the climate. So then for you to for Friedman to say, well, let's let these companies go because the government will protect us on the public interest, he's missing the fact that the very profit motive that he's respecting, if it worked like that, I'd be fine with it. The problem is the profit motive also can be advanced by moving into the political process and getting subsidies. For example, there's just a study by Penn Future of just in the state of Pennsylvania last year, $3.9 billion was paid in subsidies to the oil and gas industry. Well, where did that come from? It came from very successful lobbying. It came from paying into contributions to politicians in order to advance the interests of the businesses. So there, my argument is, well, yeah, businesses have to get political because somebody's got to stop those guys from being political, right? So it's not a situation where we have a pure separation of business and state, which might be nice. In fact, as long as business is allowed under the framework that we have to get involved in politics, then you really do have to have a position about what's okay to do and what's not okay morally for a company to get involved in.
Okay, great. We've had a couple of questions come in, so I want to direct one of them to whoever of you would like to answer. But one question that came in was, what are the constraints for a CEO who is asserting a personal sense of morality through the power of the artificial person of the corporation, when that personal morality is at odds with the prevailing moral decision-making?
I'll start off unless Eric, you want it? Go? Okay. So my first, I'd want to try to clarify a little bit. Is this coming through? Okay,
yeah,
sorry, I got some weird feedback. A little bit of clarity about the prevailing moral decision-making. So I have the question here. What are the constraints of a CEO asserting a personal sense of morality through the artificial person of the corporation when that personal morality is at odds with prevailing moral decision-making? So I'm going to assume that by prevailing moral decision-making, you mean the popular mood of the society rather than something specifically within the corporation or something like that. So assuming that that's where we're going. The first kind of constraint that I think of is simply wisdom or caution or prudence, first and foremost. After that, moral decision-making, it's not a majority vote kind of thing. It's not that the sensitivities of other people don't matter. It's not that the values of your community don't matter at all. But the initial decision of what is right or wrong God, I'm going to get killed here. I don't think it's bound by those things. I'm kind of a moral realist. And so the initial choices that the CEO would make, the decision would be individual, hopefully informed by lots of discussion and a broad understanding of issues and all of the viewpoints that she hasn't experienced for herself, right? So a broadly informed understanding of the issue, then a decision about what she personally thought was the right thing to do. In terms of and then having made that decision, so that happens not in isolation, but as a moment of personal responsibility. Having made that decision and then trying to bring the corporation into it, that's where this gets dicey. I think it would depend in large part on the understanding of the current members of the corporation. To the extent that the CEO's personal moral convictions are in line with the convictions of the corporation, I don't think it's a problem. So if the corporate agent itself is inconsistent with the prevailing moral decision making, I think it's entirely appropriate for the CEO to continue to pursue that line of action, as you've put it, through the artificial person of the corporation. Or I would suggest that the CEO should continue to guide the corporate agent, to mentor the corporate agent to work consistently with its own convictions. Again, remaining open to conversation about whether those convictions are appropriate. To the extent that the CEO is at odds with the actual commitments of the corporate agent itself, which I think has its own values, I think that she can attempt to influence them, but she can't simply override them. The CEO is not authorized to eradicate the RPV of the corporate agent and simply replace it with her own. And I can say more about why, but that's my first brush at that.
So
can I say something about that, Mike?
absolutely, yep.
Please.
Yeah, one song I usually play, sometimes I forget for my classes, is Bob Dylan's "You Got to Serve Somebody." And the reason for doing that is twofold. So one is that a CEO is an agent. The CEO is serving the interests of the corporation and the shareholders under the standard definition. And then the CEO is also at the top of the hierarchy and delegated a huge amount of the authority of this often very large enterprise. And a lot of that authority will include a moral space, a moral authority. And so I think then, and that's another meaning of our Nobel laureate rock and roller Bob Dylan, is that you choose them between the devil and the devil and the Lord sometimes, and the CEOs have to do that, and sometimes they have to do that on their own. As Kendi said, and I agree, it's usually a good idea, because you're an agent of the overall enterprise, to get advice, and so you should talk to your board. And I'm an advocate not of rubber stamp boards that the CEO gets yes people to be on the boards. I think the best advice is, and this is confirmed in some democratic theory recently, that the wisest decisions are democratic in the sense that you are involving more people than yourself. So it's also probably psychologically a good idea, maybe even legally a good idea, but to get advice about what other people think. And then there are a couple ways you run this. You can run this through the business case. So sometimes the right thing to do also happens to have a business case so you can make it easier for everyone. Sometimes, but also you can make a moral case or maybe a political case in some cases that we indicated, or what do my grandchildren, doesn't everyone's aren't all the grandchildren unified that we should have a planet that they can enjoy and will exist? So back to my climate example. But that's a really good question. Thanks for asking that.
Eric, do you have a view on laws that determine the makeup of boards? For instance, in Germany, it's by statute that labor is represented on a company's board. Do you think that would make a difference in American companies?
Well, I was afraid you're asking a question like that. I think that it's worth discussing. I mean, I think Elizabeth Warren has a proposal that does just that. I think in Germany, the discussions I've heard about, at least, and I've read about, they're not so thrilled with how it's working, and it's not expanded beyond the very large enterprises. And it seems to be a function of the power of unions in social democracy Germany. And so my guess is it's unlikely that we're going to see that kind of a move. I think it probably makes sense to have more. There's workers' councils, or there's other mechanisms by which I think companies can include more representation, more groups. I mean, right now we're thinking, I'm just thinking about the University of Pennsylvania. The students have a representative in some universities on the trustees. Penn doesn't. Is that a good sense? I was talking to a student recently who was very upset about that. It's like, that's why we don't know what's going on. And I kind of agree with that person. And so I think in any organization, I think it makes sense to think about what are the representations of the people who really matter in the firm. And my general sense is that the more you would include employees in the actual operations and understanding what is at stake, et cetera, without creating an us versus them kind of battle. I think that's the worry that I have about that. But I actually personally think there's a lot of hybrid kind of models where you are treating the employees more as owners. So even that they have a greater stake in how things work, and less as just a cog in the wheel, which doesn't seem to me to be very efficient in most cases anyway. And so it's a complicated question. I can't give you a yes and no answer. I don't think the co-determination in Germany provides a very good example right now, and I don't think that the Warren proposal is sufficiently thought through in a way that it could really work in this country. But I do think we should look at some of the laws that I think we've gone too far in the other direction, where employees are not gaining and they're not respected, and they're frankly not getting paid as well as they should, compared to those at the top who I think are leveraging their power in a way that's more selfish rather than for the firm interest as a whole.
Great. Okay. We had a question as to whether Catholic social thought, which gives primacy to working people, has informed any of your thoughts on corporate responsibility.
So I've done a little bit of work with Catholic social teaching. I've come across it not so much in connection with my work in corporate moral agency, which is really mostly metaphysics, as in a new area that I've gotten interested in about the role of work in a human life. All of us work. We all work all the time, so much. And most of the traditional philosophical literature has almost no discussion of what it is to work, what it is to work well. Probably one of the most thorough treatments is Aristotle's, where he said that anybody who works for a living is necessarily disqualified from governing because they've so completely ruined themselves. And so that's where I got into Catholic social teaching around, because it's one of the few traditions that really has a lot of valuable stuff to say about work. But I haven't incorporated it very much into my work on corporate agency, but I just sort of encountered it, so I'm just thinking about it.
Yeah, I teach a program for Collegium called the Executive Seminar, which is geared towards Penn alumni and their working careers. And we did a year-long seminar on the meaning of work. So from Hesiod up to the singularity and the rise of the robots. And it's as different as Plato and Aristotle are from each other. They both agree that if you have to work for a living, you're doing something wrong.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. It's so discouraging.
It's only when work has kind of the divine sanction, that you see in Genesis 1, that it comes to be a source of meaning in the Western tradition, anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to ask. Kendi, you argue that a corporation can be a moral agent over and above the moral positions of the individuals who make up the corporation.
Yeah.
So, and you refer to thousands of years of ethical teaching, which is, my bread and butter here. So when we talk about forming individuals in an ethical outlook or ethical tradition, we have a lot of information on how to do that. You can habituate people, you can raise them to be Kantians or utilitarians. How would you go about forming non-human moral agents like a corporation to own up to the responsibility in a way that's going to make a difference?
Yeah, so you'd mentioned this before. I've been thinking about it since. I never get to do the practical stuff. It's so hard to get people to agree that they even should do this that I haven't really gotten very far past that initial step. But what we're really talking about is simply institutionalizing moral concern. And so a lot of the mechanisms that we use to make sure that corporations or that corporate agents and their members are obeying laws, that they're abiding by positive law, could be used to simply guide them toward moral law. Now, the moral law is much harder to track down than the positive law, but it doesn't change all the time. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. So each corporation, each corporate agent would have to decide, and I would strongly recommend that we turn to some of the stuff that Eric was talking about there, that there be some kind of, not necessarily bottom up, but some sort of inclusive process by which this got networked about what the moral commitments would be, and then start kind of an extended form of habituation, implementing policies. And then, see, this is the part we never do. You draft a mission statement and you stick it up on the wall somewhere and it just gathers dust and nothing ever happens with it, right? That's not moral action. So first you'd have to come up with your moral commitments, your mission statement. Then you have to convince people to live into it. And this is where we fail utterly, mostly, because you can't, in a very different sense than is usually meant, you can't legislate morality. You can't give people all of the rules to follow and expect people to mindlessly implement this. It doesn't work in our personal lives and it doesn't work collectively. You have to get people to buy in to the mission, to the vision, and adopt it. Because if they don't, if your members don't buy into it, they won't enact it. They won't enact it individually, which I'm not worried about here, and they won't enact it collectively. They won't be sensitive enough to shape their actions sufficiently to guide the corporate collective actions, which are much harder to control than your personal actions. They won't see where it falls down. They won't adjust for it. They won't change the policies when the policies aren't working. You have to have people on board for that. And my college, the College of the Holy Cross, I've never seen anything like it. I was at a private law firm, great big, huge law firm, 1,000 lawyers, right? Big public universities, no. College of the Holy Cross has a mission, and you can stop most of the students walking across campus, walking across the Hovel, and ask them, and they can spit back to you big chunks of the mission statement. Like, they know it, and the faculty know it, and we talk about it, and it comes up in arguments. And I'm not saying we're all really living the mission or that Holy Cross itself does. It's very complicated, but that's the kind of investment you'd have to have. It has to matter. And you can foster that institutionally by who you give raises to and who you don't. But if you treat it like a mechanical problem instead of a person problem, it'll never happen.
It's cultural to the corporate culture.
Yeah.
In the same way that your personal ethics are cultural to the culture you grow up in.
Yeah.
Eric.
Laws without morality are useless. That's the motto of the University of Pennsylvania. I'm not sure how many people can say it, but if I took a poll, I'm not sure how many of our students would know. But I like your question, Mike, and the way I would go with it is I think we really need to humanize corporations. And this is in a way that I think Kendi and I would both agree with, a recognition that there are moral responsibilities, both that the firm has as a whole, but also as individuals have. And we probably can start with employees and with the value of work. You were talking about religiously valuing people, but also work. And I think we could really do a lot in our society if we just started to, on an everyday basis, first of all, but then I think there are some legal things we could do, recognize people as being valued. And whatever the job is that they're doing, and if it's a contributing job that's benefiting the society, that we recognize that, we respect that. And we don't just treat them as someone to be laid off so that somebody else can make more money in the stock market. One of my pet theories would be of change, which I don't think we can do yet, would be, one of my pet peeves is that we constantly are looking at the stock market for whether things are going well in the economy or not. A part of me would like to see what's the employment rate of how many good, well-paying jobs do people have today compared to yesterday, rather than what's the stock price. And I think that is part of our problem, is that we've abstracted this idea of profit, which is a good thing. That's what business should do. But then we've made it the only thing. We made stock price the only thing that anyone cares about. And I think that has had a dehumanizing effect on us, and we need to come back away from that.
Right.
Amen.
That's well said. Thank you. And thank you both for your participation in this really interesting conversation tonight.